What's up, big guy?
Welcome. How
Oh
was
man,
uh how was your lengthy meeting?
it was good. It's somebody I enjoy meeting with from TCU and everything like that. We still got to wrap up some of the previous studies or the several previous studies that we kind of had going on there. And I've been putting those things off for about the past month or two, kind of while we had the transition going.
Right.
And so there was 2 hours and some worth of things to talk about outside of kind of those formal, hey, how are you? It's good to see you again. I haven't
Right.
talked to you in a while. How's life been? How's the house coming? How's the job? How's the teaching load? All those things before we actually get to the meat and potatoes of what you actually need to talk about during the meeting. And so before you know it, we've talked about Seaspiracy, because we're talking about an omega-3 study. And so it's like, oh my gosh, I have to go get algae omega-3s now, which I don't know if it makes a real difference or if it just makes me feel better personally,
Mhm.
which probably the latter. But that's here nor there. But anyways, it was a great meeting.
That's good. Glad at least it was productive. I can see you're hydrating there, so that's good.
I actually slammed this about 2 seconds ago because I forgot a water receptacle today. And so I had to run down to our little water bottle filling machine and get this so I could have some water so my throat doesn't dry out. I had to do it quick too because we just got some COVID updates. So I know it's probably been a little bit since you've been inside the university situation, getting all those good updates.
Yeah.
Well, probably not a little bit. You haven't been out that long, I guess.
I mean, a couple
Long
months.
enough to be out of the loop, and now all of a sudden no one cares about you anymore. So
Yeah,
sad.
exactly. Great.
But I have to run down to do anything in public spaces because we're at mask in public spaces again right now. And we'll get some updates on how we're going to progress through the semester right now, which I am not excited to hear because I don't anticipate it will be favorable for teaching, research, everything like that.
Yeah. I don't envy you. And now, especially with the whole Delta variant coming in hot, I'm kind of glad I'm taking this gap year because I don't think I'd be getting the research in that I'd want to be getting in anyways. So it might be working out in my favor for this, for my selfish reasons there for being glad.
Yeah.
Now.
It's such a crazy situation. You finally get back into thinking that you're going to have some level of, I wouldn't even say normalcy, but that you're getting back into a good flow of, are close or similar to how things used to be. I will say that the one thing we do have now is being more responsive and less reactive. And that depends on where you're at, what your university guidelines are and things like that. But I think here at USM, where I'm at now, we do tend to be a little bit more responsive rather than reactive. And so
Good.
there's more of the, we know kind of what to do. We went through, March of 2020. We went through the entire year trying to figure out how to be productive in research and format our teaching. So if they do pass the guidelines down, it's not this crazy panic. And so we're kind of able to plan a little bit better, but I agree for your own reasons. The gap year would be nice because it's kind of like teaching online after a while. You're just like, oh my gosh, I really just need to get in the classroom. I'll wear a full hazmat suit if I can just be in the classroom or something.
Heck yeah.
And I'm kind of getting there with research as well, where the surveys and stuff like that, they're great and super informative, but we really just need some of those randomized control trials.
There's been a kind of a gap for the past year, over a year now, because nobody's been able to really get any kind of solid research done. There's been the really lucky individuals that were able to bring actual studies into labs. But
yeah, you'll have some of the, it's unfortunate, I think, in a few different ways. The first way is that you have a lot of really young, hungry researchers that were really ready to get their foot in the door and really had a lot of great ideas that had to kind of put them on hold. And then kind of restructure and reorganize how they were going to proceed. And so you're missing out on a lot of really good kind of creative ideas in this field from some of those younger generations, some of your 90s kids, researchers, right? That are kind of just now coming to the surface. And then you have some of the more, and I'm not saying that there's any issues with some of your more older and established professors. Obviously, they're putting out really great research. They've got great funding to be able to do this really great research, but they've also kind of partnered with some of the bigger hospitals and bigger organizations that has kind of potentially allowed them to have a little bit more leniency in what it is that they can and can't do. So you're kind of having similar voices that are able to produce the research that have kind of always been able to produce a lot of the really good research, and less of the really young and hungry guys with some new ideas. And so, there's some give and take there. It kind of depends on where you're at, how established you are. But I'm curious to see I guess, kind of what happens in general, right? So we had this weird situation where COVID shut everything down, and you're thinking that no research is going to come out. But really what ends up happening is, oh my gosh, I finally have time to be able to write all this stuff up.
From stuff I've already done, yeah.
So we're trying to send to journals right now, and it's like, hey, sorry, this seems like a great thing, but we're only accepting what we rate as a top 10 percentile of submissions, because we have just hundreds of submissions and not enough people to go through it. So you'll have to find somewhere else. I'm like, why is that happening? Duh, people have had time to write.
Yeah.
And now you've had people that have been able to collect data for 4 months that I know were just itching. So they were just grinding it out, recruiting, getting things done really quickly. And so again, once we go back into lockdown, you're probably going to see another huge spike in just this really kind of short duration, kind of random research coming out.
Yep. That's why I'm trying to get mine in review next month, by next month, to try to get the ball rolling that as quick as possible before everybody and their mother starts submitting to journals again and all that. So,
well, I think that with yours, I think there's it's a little bit different for kind of what it is that you do. There's not that much research out there for what you do, to my knowledge. And it's kind of an interesting question, right? And so I think just the interest in the question sometimes is better as far as from a submission standpoint or getting a publication standpoint, as how rigorous the study actually was, right? Kind of, if that makes sense, right? And so whenever I have some of my keto research, the ears start perking up, right? Everybody hears keto, they hear things like intermittent fasting, body fat, weight loss, all those things. Ears perk up because everybody wants to know, right? And so I think that's something that you might benefit from yourself.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
You look skinny, by the way. Where are you at with everything, man?
I am sitting at a full week and a half out from show. I was 150 pounds this morning. I am quite depleted and lean.
So what are you down from? Because the 150, from what I remember you weighing, is quite small.
So the heaviest I got to in March was 207.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. So I am now 57 pounds down.
How many weeks do you got, or what was your prep?
So prep was probably 20 weeks, but I've been in a caloric deficit since the middle of April. So it's really been an extended amount of time.
Well, you kind of have to with that big of a drop.
With 57 pounds to drop. Yeah.
Well, you look good, man. I think it's coming together really well, I think.
Thanks. It's been a grind, but I'm glad it's coming. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel here. So that's good.
So when is the actual date?
The 14th of this month.
Okay.
The Texas Pro here in Irving. And then 2 months after that, I'll probably do the Johnny O. Jackson in
nice. Yeah.
Fort Worth. Keep it nice and local. See what happens.
So that's 2 weeks after. You said that's 2 weeks after?
Yeah. So I have a nice 2-week window there to kind of regroup a little bit and start a new peak week.
So what's that like? So I guess I have some previous experience with kind of what you would do, what the preps would or generally look like leading up to one individual show. What goes on, just from my own general knowledge, between one show and another show that's a week to 2 weeks apart, right? Do you just kind of maintain? Do you deviate away from your diet based on how you did before?
It depends.
What does it look like?
So it depends on how lean and how sharp I'm coming in for the first one. If I come in for the first one and I don't have much room to drop any more, or there's really not much many more improvements I can make in a 2-week time span, really a 1-week time span, because I start peak week again a week after that. So if there's really not that much improvement for me to make, then it's really more just maintain where we're at, maybe grind a little bit, get ready for another peak week. If I still have some more to lose, then it's like we're gonna pedal the metal for this full week here. You're gonna see how much weight you can drop in a week, and then come in even sharper for the next one. So the goal is to always, when you're doing a competition season, so like you do like over the course of like, I don't know, a month and a half, 2 months, you compete 2 or 3 times. Your goal is to come in sharper each consecutive one. So it just really depends on where you're at for the first one, how much you have to lose going into the next ones.
I mean, that's rough. So then with that, between your actual shows, whenever you're trying to figure out, how sharp you want to look, I guess in a lot of ways you mean similar to like what your conditioning would be. Is that kind of a way that you mean? Yeah. So then what dietary changes are you making within those weeks? So let's say you do your show. Do you still get to have your post-show cheat meal?
So it's not quite, the same, like, all right, let's go binge on, let's go have a cheeseburger, fries, milkshake, have a beer. You can have something a little more sweet and satiating or savory. But it's really like more, okay, like maybe something a little tastier to hold you over, but we really don't want to be throwing in these super high palatable foods in between shows, because like really it's going to mess you up more mentally than anything else, because you're like, God, I miss this. Now you might be more apt to really jack up your diet. So really saving the big, nice, highly palatable stuff for after the last one, and even after that, you don't want to rush into it too quick, because you can really throw on a lot when your body's in that kind of low, super responsive state. It will want to put on some weight quick, so you got to be careful. So my coach is really going to be monitoring that post last show, which would be good.
So there's actually so much stuff in there just to even talk into. I'll try and remember those things, especially with the palatability of the meal and how that's going to influence you. Even just seeing some of the things and smelling some of those things that you've had to eliminate from the diet, being so restricted with what it is that you do. I mean, it can really mess you up. But I guess you said having something too sweet, too savory. Which one do you prefer? What's your go-to? Are you sweet or savory?
Post-show, savory. So I'll go for pizza or a cheeseburger, something like that, if I was up to my own devices. Sure.
I think that's most people. I think a lot of times whenever you see like all your bodybuilders Instagram posts, they're not going out and getting, some people will get donuts, pancakes, things like that. And, that's obviously just that taste, that really high reward sensation that is individual to that person. But overall, I would imagine that most people are going to get pizzas. And I think pizza is the big one. Pizzas, burgers, maybe chicken wings.
I've always done burgers post-show. I'll go to favorite burger place in town or whatever I'm in the mood for at that point. Burger, a beer, some cheese fries or something. But I got to be careful with that one now. After this, the first show, can't really do that. After the second show, I'll go have one nice, like, let's hammer it away meal, make my heart happy a little bit, and then regroup.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've been in some level of a struggle for 20 plus weeks now. And so you've kind of been missing out on that reward aspect that you get from anything. And so that's why generally I would imagine that most people would go towards having some of those more high fattening foods rather than doing the really carb heavy foods, which you would think that, hey, I'm depleting carbs all the time. The first thing I'm going to want to do is go back and just start eating a bunch of carbohydrates. But typically it's more associated with that reward, right? Which is what you're going to get from things like your really highly fattening foods, like your burgers, pizzas, stuff like that. I always say, whenever you're looking at carbohydrates and how they influence reward. And obviously it depends on the taste, and everybody's kind of got this individual, genetic predisposition for taste, but no one's ever drank a soda and been like, oh my gosh, this is the best thing I've ever had in my entire life. Like, I'm so like, I just want to keep drinking soda and keep drinking soda. But right, whenever you eat a pizza, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't stop eating this pizza. That's when you hear people say, what? Like, oh, please take it away from me. Please get it out of my face. It's never with, those sugary things for the most part, which is individual, of course. That's kind of its own story. So then anyways, for whenever you're going to the next show, does your water intake change at all?
Keep it pretty consistent, 4 to 5 liters a day, throughout prep. Obviously show day might take it back a little bit, but I really like to stay hydrated. I'm not one of those people, and my coach is one of those coaches that likes to really shunt water away the day of show. It can really be somewhat more detrimental than anything else if I'm just all of a sudden no water. So that's nice. I'm not really kind of shunting the water away, kind of keep that consistent the whole time. You really don't want to throw anything at your body that it hasn't been doing, because that will mess things up even more. And then,
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's just it's a kind of semi-dangerous thing to do as well. Especially with how much you've been, depending on how, strict your prep was or how short duration that your prep was. Some people that will do exactly what you've done, right? Which is, lose 50 plus pounds, but instead of doing that over 20 plus weeks, we're knocking that out in a 12-week prep. Obviously it depends on where you're starting at, and, not everybody is that well informed on how to do these things. And, if you have a good coach, hopefully they're taking care of that for you, telling you how long your prep needs to be. But of course, that's not the case. So just depleting the water, I would agree, is probably just generally not a great idea. And it, really, what difference is it going to make positively for when you get on stage? Probably not too much, I would imagine. And you can probably shed more light on that if you've had that experience on how differences in water, if they really make that much difference.
Not so much water as, controlling maybe sodium intake day or a couple days out beforehand, to make sure you're really not retaining any of that subcutaneously. That even then, like, kind of, I think people make a bigger deal out of it than they need to. Obviously, it can be important if you just go and totally screw something up and have a ton of sodium, and all of a sudden you're retaining a bunch of water and you look super spilled over. You do need to be careful a little bit and control it, but staying hydrated is really important, especially day of competition. You're already so mentally just fuzzy and fatigued from a prep, being so low carb or just low cal for an extended period of time. So staying hydrated can kind of alleviate that a little bit. Prevents a little bit of muscular fatigue and any kind of cramping that could happen on stage, which is what you don't want at all. So
no, especially when you're getting, depending on how dramatic your routine is, you see people get into some crazy positions. The last thing you want to do is to get down on one knee and then that hamstring cramp up, and you're stuck in that, and you're not getting out of that position.
Exactly. That's a good way. That's a really good way to get some points deducted there. So,
and I mean, in general with sodium and stuff like that too, it's a super important point is, I mean, the body really does need sodium, and you have so much restriction going on that when you start doing that, man, I can't imagine what you'd feel like once you get on stage. Like you said, you're already pretty mentally shot leading up to that point after peak week, after all the, the work that you've been putting in, the restriction that you have. Kind of like I said, leading up to this point, to just throw away sodium, to not hydrate the right way. You are an angry bear if you can even think without having some level of brain fog up to that point. So, man, that just the stress is insane.
Yep.
Which is not going to help the way that you look on stage either.
No, but it's okay. It is what it is, but
you'll get there.
I know.
So But so then I guess after your second show, so you're keeping everything similar, just kind of making some small changes based on the way that you look on the first one. What's your diet look like after you get done with your second show? So assuming that's kind of like the last show of your season, then what does a diet look like after? So let's say kind of just like immediately after and then a couple months after.
Right. So immediately after, I'm going to come back up closer to maintenance. I don't want to just all of a sudden, all right, show's over, it's bulking season, let's go. Kind of easing our way back into that. So bring back up to maintenance, then slowly starting to establish that caloric surplus again, where I can start to put on some size. But it take really controlling that at first, making sure I'm not diving off the deep end too quick into too much of a caloric surplus too quickly. That's a really good way to have your body start storing away a lot of fat super quick, because it thinks it's starving, and it's like, all right, food, we might not ever get this again. We need to save this and store this, so.
Yeah. And I think in general too, and I mean, you can definitely speak on this, and I have my own kind of thoughts about the whole post-show dilemma that you're going to find, because in a lot of ways, I think, I'm not sure exactly where, the bodybuilding industry is and the show industry is and stuff like that. But I know whenever I was as deep into, wanting to be a bodybuilder as a lower level than you, but, as I ever got, was definitely everybody wants to do a show. Everybody wants to be a bodybuilder. Instagram fitness had just started. You had your Paige Hathaways, your Devin Physiques, all these big people who were just like taking over social media with fitness, right? And so everybody wants to be these people and do the shows. And I'm hyperverbal, so you have to excuse me. And then you have people doing the shows, and they may have a coach, they may not. Most of the time, I would imagine that they do. And they go through all this crazy restriction. It may be the first time I've ever done some form of like extreme dietary restriction ever in their entire life. And then they don't continue to work with their coach afterwards, or maybe our coaches weren't as experienced 10 years ago as they should have been. And you have these crazy eating disorders that occur, acutely or potentially chronically afterwards. And then people are just gaining all this weight. They look nothing like what they used to. They stopped exercising. And a lot of that is because of their actions after they did their shows, which is, I'm going to eat as much as I possibly can because I restricted for so long, not thinking about all the metabolic stress that they are undergoing up to that point, and all the maladaptations that they had made metabolically. And then they not only look worse than they did on stage, they have gained weight gained weight and not good weight from before they even decided they wanted to do the show. And then they've actually gone into like some overweight classifications and things like that. It is crazy about what you go through mentally and physiologically, and that kind of interplay that you have between those two systems, and how you just destroy it or everything after you do something like as extreme as what it is you do. So obviously, you know this, but just to kind of speak on how important it is to make sure that you are taking it slow, having your chicken wings, having your pizzas and burgers and stuff like that, because I do think that it is important to include, but not doing that every day for 2 months.
Yeah. So that's why burnout in this sport is so high. People do like one show or may not even finish a prep, and they're like, I can't do it, don't want to do it anymore. And that's okay. It's not for everybody. There's a reason why it's kind of such a small and niche sport and community, because it's very different. People don't understand it if they're from the outside looking in, and it's very difficult mentally and physically. Not saying that every sport and competition isn't difficult mentally and physically, but one like this, where you're putting this much strain on your body through the extreme dieting process, as well as continuing to keep training volume high the whole time, just really wears people down mentally. And I don't think they know what they're biting into before they start preps and go into the show, especially if they don't have a coach that hasn't prepared them well for this, which is why for anybody that's wanted to come to me for competition prep coaching, anything like that, I will not take them on unless they understand what it is that I'm going to be expecting from them from the start all the way through it. I walk them through. I might end up scaring people away from it with as serious as I make it, but that's good. If you can't take it serious like this, you don't need to be doing it.
Yep. I'll go ahead and chime in on that. I think that although it might be a difficult conversation to have sometimes, as far as, hey, these are the expectations, this is what you need to be doing, this is what it's going to take, and it's going to scare some people away, and that may not feel good. I'm assuming you don't like telling people this either,
No.
right? There's nothing fun about saying like, hey man, I don't think that you're like well suited for this right now. And there's nothing good about hearing you being like, oh, I think I want to do a show. And then somebody who's really looking out for your best interest, which doesn't appear that way at first, is saying like, hey, I don't think that you're really like out for this right now. It's better than getting into the point where it's like, I'm not identifying those expectations at the beginning. You're not equipped for it. You get halfway through. Not only do you feel this crazy restriction and you are going, depending on how seriously you're taking it, you are going through some different physiological changes and mental, you're running low on psychological resources, right, to be able to handle this really complex situation you've gotten yourself into. Well, once you run out of those complex resources, you've had those physiological changes, or you've run out of the physiological resources to handle the situation, had the physiological changes, and then you have to quit. It doesn't feel good. And now we're going to go into a different place. And then sometimes a really dark place for people when it comes to diet is, okay, I felt really bad. I've been restricting for a while. I don't have any more resources mentally to think through what I need to be doing. I'm just going to start eating, right? I need to feel a little bit of this reward. I need to do these things, or I need to make myself feel better. I think it's going to be okay. I don't have the nutritional knowledge, right, to be able to understand how to get back out of this and go back to maintenance. And then you end up with people gaining a significant amount of weight, right, because they quit and, went backwards backwards to the point that they were at before they even started the prep, or behind where they were, as far as things like weight loss and body fat percent and things like that. So it can be detrimental to actually like go through it and quit. But I think it's better to just identify those things at the beginning, so at least they don't hurt themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, do you take those people on as clients outside of bodybuilding and stuff like that as well?
So yeah, I will bring people on if they come to me saying they want to do a show. I tell them probably not ready for that, but I will give them the caveat here of yet. If you want my help getting you ready for that, it might take a year, it might take 18 months, it might take 2 years. I will help you, but I won't, honestly, I'll be straight up, I won't rush you into something that you're not ready for, and then you're burn out and never do it again. So I will take them on outside of that and say, you know what, let's put this as a long-term goal. Let's set some short-term goals now to get there step by step. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most one. I'm going to say that probably a million times. Have to excuse me about things being the most important. But as just a term, or just a way to say that it is incredibly important is how many people do you get that are anticipating that everything is going to change, entire life is going to change in like a month or two.
Right.
Most people would probably are unaware of actually the amount of time that it takes to do some full body composition transformation for themselves, especially when you're talking about using your body to compete in a way or in a challenge about how good your body looks. Mm-hmm. So most people you get, they're like, I think I want to do a show one day. Well, it doesn't look like you've worked out that consistently for a really long time. So I think we need to start working out consistently for a really good amount of time before we think about putting your body's physique on stage.
Right. Yep. Right. And I had this discussion with on my last podcast with a coaching buddy of mine, Joel Cummins. One of the big things we talked about was giving yourself time. Even as an experienced competitor, you need to give yourself the proper time through a prep, because a lot of people underestimate the amount of like body fat they might have to lose and might overestimate the amount of muscle mass they currently have. So giving yourself proper time is very, very important, and having a really good understanding of that and someone to give you a good objective point of view on how much time you actually need is crucial. So
Yeah.
that's why even the best competitors have coaches, because they need that objective point of view.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you're always your own worst enemy too. And so having the coach is great because it's easy whenever things get really difficult to try and self-diagnose yourself in the way that you see most fit, not that's actually most fit for you. So if I'm having a really or a rough week, I don't have a coach, and I'm like, well, do I really need to work out today? Man, I just don't feel like working out today, or I don't feel like eating this way today. I think it's okay if I have a few extra calories today. You try to do your own self-justification on there, which is actually going to set you back much further because you're really not being objective with yourself. You're trying to justify what it is that you want, which is always, again, not good. And I typically see that. I always say I'm very cautious with who I tell what I say I do whenever I'm meeting certain people, right? Because the first thing that you're going to get whenever you're some sort of exercise or dietary professional, something like that, is, hey, what do you do? Okay, well, I'm a professor. What do you? Oh, okay. So what do you teach? Well, I always have to get that question. I was like, okay, I teach and do research, but right now I teach sports nutrition, and then I actually do dietary intervention research or dietary strategy research, specifically things like intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, stuff like that. First thing is, so I've been doing the paleo diet. What do you think about that? Right? Does it work? And I'm like, man, I don't know if I want to have this conversation with you, but also, are you actually wondering my honest, true opinion on this matter? Or do you just want me to justify or help you self-justify what you're doing, or validate, what it is that you're already doing or have been thinking about doing up to this point? And so I have to be very careful with kind of how I answer these questions because, in general, just if you were to ask me, what's the best diet, which I'm sure you probably get pretty often too, is what diet should I do? Or what's the best diet? Or, just these kind of random assortment of diet related questions, or what supplements I should be taking. There you go. It's another good one, which that one actually you may be able to discuss a little bit more depending on who you're talking to. But typically when, I get those questions, I don't know where exactly I was going with that specifically. I had an endpoint there in mind. I have to be very careful with what it is I do because in general, I don't actually believe, and it's just my opinion, that any diet is really successful or not successful. I think that in general, most of the time, there are certain principles that you need to go off of, and that you need to be able to or self-identify what you're most equipped to do. But of course, then we get into the battle of how much knowledge does this individual actually have to be able to make these decisions appropriately on their own, to be able to select a diet, so to speak, that's going to be best suited for them. And then what's the strategy? Are we talking about, a different type of, macronutrient composition diets? Are we talking, keto? Are we talking high carb?
Right.
Are we talking, higher protein, adapted keto, carnivore, all those weird things? Are we talking elimination diets where you can have more of an assortment of macronutrients, but now you got to eliminate half the grocery store because you're not allowed to have any preservatives, right? Or you're not allowed to have any rice or anything that's been, refined in any particular way.
Right.
Or are we talking about a timing strategy, right? So things like intermittent fasting, or one meal a day is another big one right now, which is beyond me in my own personal ability to do something. There are just so many different diets out there. It's almost impossible to say one is the best or one is going to be best suited for you. I think the best thing, and you would probably agree with this, is to take the principles, things like, how much calories matter, how much protein matters, and then whatever else, depending on what it is that you need, you kind of need to just determine that, but keep those two things in mind.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so for the general weight loss population, it's always my firm belief that the law of thermodynamics always wins,
Yes.
So pick a diet that works for you, I guess, as long as you're in a caloric deficit, if you like it, whatever, as long as there's no, negative side effects that's occurring with this diet to your health or anything like that, mentally or physically. As long as you're eating fewer calories than you're burning in a day, the diet's going to work. That's why diets work, because they put you in a caloric deficit, not because of some magical, thing that's occurring with this diet.
Man. And, I think there's a lot to get into there. And I think specifically is the best thing that I can do for people. And now, I think it's, before I even start with that, it's important to identify the audience or the person that you're talking to. Because if you're just talking about stages of change, right? So like that psychological model that tells you like when a person actually ready to take some action and change whatever it is they're going through, when they're kind of in the appropriate stage of change and they're asking you, what should I do? Or is this something that would work for me type of question? I really think it's important to not say or overcomplicate, number one, because then that person's going to get really disappointed. Like, oh, wow, look how stupid I am. I don't know anything about these, like what this person thinks is like this really basic principle that I should know. Right. And then they're not going to want to make a change at all. Right. And then you're going to have the people that are like, how do I say it? Those people that are going to get really disappointed. And then you don't want to start suppress their kind of, how do I say it? The juice. I don't know, they're like the most technical words there, but that juice, they're all juiced up to get on this diet and make this change. You don't want to be like, oh no, that sucks. That's a stupid diet that you should do. And then you're like, oh, well, I guess maybe I shouldn't do it. And now we're at however many months behind them actually making some changes because you suppressed kind of what it was that they want to do.
Yeah.
And so I think the biggest thing to do is to identify the person, kind of help them work or through what best diet is for them, like with their own, making it seem like it's their own ideas.
Mm-hmm. Some adaptive facilitation there. Yeah.
Yeah. You want to get them to say like, oh yeah, that actually makes sense. That actually makes sense. And then they can actually like take some of those small principles and start applying them. And then they can hopefully, grow into, being able to figure out which diet is best for them. But I think you want to identify how unsuccessful most diets in general are, especially when people are asking you about things like fad diets, right? And so regardless of the diet, so it doesn't necessarily matter if people asking you which one's the best, ketogenic diet, paleo diet, carnivore, whatever it is, right? Typically these people have some weight to lose. All right, so these are your general weight loss population. And that's kind of what they're going after, is almost all diets fail after a certain point. And not only do almost all diets fail after a certain point, so the data would suggest that after 3 years, 95% of people who lose weight on a diet gain it back. So that's 3 years. So if you were to take that same exact model and do that with any sort of like major disease, let's say, right? So let's say, hey, we're going to give you this heart treatment. But after 3 years, 95% of people are actually going to go right back to how terrible their heart was right before. You'd be like, no, I don't really want to do that treatment. That sounds like a really bad idea. What's the other option? Right. And so I think identifying that is a really important thing to do just right from the start. And not only identifying that, but identifying, that there's a really nice chance. I think the last data that I looked at on this was about 42% of people who start the diet, let's say within that same kind of 3 year period, 42% of the people, not only do they gain all their initial weight back that they lost, but actually gain more weight than they had before. Right. And now I don't know exactly how much that varies based on diet, but I believe that that's just all diets, people that are trying to do some form of weight loss diet, regardless of the method that they choose. And so really what that comes down to, if we're talking 95% of people, so 95 out of 100 people, right, are not going to be successful. What we need to do is to try and figure out how to get you to be in those five people by helping educate you, number one. And then by allowing you to have range of choice, because you have a nature about you, especially when it comes to your dietary habits. You've been familiarized to the way that you eat, most likely since you were a child, right? And now you can make those changes. And there's always the argument of, well, if you want to lose weight, you just need to lose the weight and you need to keep it off. So let's just eliminate the okay, you got to pull yourself up and, make it happen. If we just eliminate that from the discussion here, because that, does play some role, that, more goal-oriented or more, more goal-oriented people are able to kind of keep that weight off, right? They're doing something for a particular reason, rather than just like, hey, I don't like the way I look in the mirror. And I've been that way for years and years and years and never made a change type of thing, right? So again, let's eliminate that. How can we get you to get to the point that you want to be at without being one of those people who's going to go backwards? And that's, in my opinion, is going to be through just, number one, education. And then number two is allowing you to have choice. Right. So we can go into like kind of the keto stuff, right? Since that's kind of a big deal. And obviously super popular, is you'll always have the people that come up to you, is keto a good diet to do? Right. If I were to say no, which typically I'd be like, well, I'm not going to say that the keto diet doesn't work, because keto diet does work. Right. And I think what kind of misconstrues the overall success of keto is how quickly it works relative to some of the other more traditional methods, just like basic caloric restriction, right? So, to wait really quickly. And so that's why I want to do this diet if it's going to change within a month or two, right? Within a week, carbohydrates coming out of the muscle or during ketosis. So obviously there's got to be, because of how quickly that it works, right? Deal with that. Certain point, once you things like social, right? And now you've just eliminated an entire macronutrient from your diet, right? And so what's the first thing that you're going to want to do? You're going to want to feel some of that reward. You're going to want to re-include some of those things that you had already eliminated from the diet. And then that's when the mental issues are going to kind of set in. And that's when you're going to kind of succumb to some of those, acute eating disorders, some of those binge eating disorders that a lot of people are not well equipped to be able to get themselves out of. And so that's something to really consider whenever you're talking about such an extreme restriction diet there. And then you also want to discuss kind of the principle of, how ketogenic diet works. So most people would be like, well, if I'm eating more of fat and not eating the carbohydrates, right, I'm going to be burning more fat. And that's kind of the idea. And you would know, right, and maybe we can just discuss it with the audience, is that, yes, that's true, but you got to talk about the calories. The calories, the thermodynamics will always overcome everything or as far as the success of the diet. And so what ends up happening, of course, why you do see significant fat loss happening on the ketogenic diet, is that typically whenever you eliminate an entire macronutrient out of the diet and you're controlling protein, right, you're passively going to be in some sort of caloric deficit. Right. And that's what's going to happen. And so then you get into what you have called fat balance and carbohydrate balance, where yes, you are burning more fat, right? That is correct whenever you're on the ketogenic diet, but you're also storing more fat as well, right? And so how do we know if we're going to be burning more fat or storing more fat? Well, it depends on the amount of calories. Calorie surplus, you're going to be storing more fat. Calorie deficit, you're going to be burning more fat, right? So again, what really matters is, right, your total caloric intake. Then you get into, if you were to do it the opposite way with like things like carbohydrate balance, right, or fat balance, right? If you're doing a high carbohydrate diet, yeah, you're not burning as much fat, but you're also not storing as much fat. Right. So then it goes back into the caloric deficit or surplus, which is going to decide whether or not you're storing or you're burning more.
Right.
And so that's really what it comes down to with keto. Because, I mean, even whenever we look at some of the studies that we've done with keto, we're not seeing this massive weight loss that's coming from body fat or percentage, whenever the calories on the ketogenic diet are the same as everywhere else, right? And so we're only seeing really the weight loss coming from, just not necessarily body fat percentage, but just some of the initial changes you're going to see with things like water loss and then carbohydrate loss in the muscle. And it can be really deceptive, basically. It's kind of what it comes down to. So it's very important to understand if that's going to be good for you to do, if you're mentally equipped to be able to, handle that level of restriction. And if that's suited for your taste as well. Some people probably really do good on at some level of adapted keto, because if you look at some of their diet in general, they may just not eat that many carbohydrates. They may eat a lot of eggs, right? They may eat a lot of, or use a lot of oils in their food. They may eat a lot of avocados. And if you let them just passively eat whatever they want throughout the day, they may only be getting 125 grams of carbs and exercising and doing everything else, right? So they may be able to go into a ketogenic diet if they so choose, right? Now I would imagine that if you're only eating 125 grams of carbohydrates and eating those healthy things like avocados and eggs and whatnot, that you probably don't need to go on a very strict diet. You probably look okay so long as you're exercising in the first place. But again, that's here nor there. But identifying what your nature is, what you've been familiarized to your entire life up to this point that you're trying to change, it's important to consider that, I guess, is kind of what it comes down to.
Right. I like that. Well, let's talk a little bit about what you've got on your horizon now with any cool research you've got lined up. So let me introduce you super quick. We actually get a formal introduction here.
Yeah.
So on the podcast here today is now Dr. Austin Graybeal. I like to think he's a good bud of mine. Without his help, my time at TCU completing my master's would have been significantly worse off. So I'm very thankful for him for that. He's done some awesome research into fats. And like, describe your research to the audience here, and your time at Tech, TCU, and then what's on the horizon for you now at Mississippi State.
Southern Mississippi. Don't insult me.
Sorry.
Okay. No, we're much closer to the beach. We're actually in hurricane season down here right now. That's how close we are to everything as far as the beach goes. But yeah, so you kind of already introduced, Dr. Austin Graybeal and whatnot, where I'm at, Southern Mississippi, here, starting my first semester, first go around here with a faculty position as an assistant professor here. It all kind of started, I actually started off at a community college. So for anybody that thinks that's a bad idea, absolutely not. Did my first 2 years at Tarrant County Community College. Did my first 2 years there. Then I went and finished my bachelor's at Texas Tech. And I had originally anticipated that I just wanted to be a football coach. I was a big football player, not big as in a large football player. I enjoyed playing football quite a bit. And then once I actually got to Tech and saw some of the athletes there, it made sense why Texas Tech did not call me. So again, that's here nor there. But so I went there. I had anticipated on being just a football coach. Realized I did not really like kids as much as I thought that I liked, as far as being a high school football coach, and the school system. I just didn't really think that was suited for me after I had some more formal experience into working there. And so I had that kind of early 20s freak out on what am I going to do with my life. And so an opportunity got presented to me to, do my master's at Texas Tech. And so I was a GA or a GTA there at Texas Tech. And I had wanted to go into strength and conditioning. So I was like, okay, I don't really want to work with high school athletes. I think I want to do the college thing, and maybe I can do college strength and conditioning coaching there. And so then once I actually started getting into that, I realized how difficult it is to actually get those positions. And I never had any formal, collegiate athletic experience, right? Which is something that is really highly touted there as something that you would need to be able to be competitive in that market, including things like internships. And then it goes down to just a who type of business. The coaches are going to bring in, who they know and who they want, and you're going to have to build yourself up quite a bit for that and not get that much pay. And so I was fortunate to have my graduate advisor. His name is Dr. Grant Tinsley. He had just got done with his PhD, very similar to kind of, the situation I'm in. I was his first graduate student. He had some undergraduate students working before me, but first graduate student researcher. And he just happens to be not only the best person in the entire world, one of those people that you can see visually getting angry, but is so calm and collected that it's just paining him to even be angry. Right. So one of those just generally nice people. And he really took me under his wing and kind of showed me what research was. And then I kind of just got the bug and I fell in love with doing it. I felt that was something I could be really good at there. And so all the research originally started off with some dietary supplementation research, specifically the use of HMB.
Right.
which you may or may not want to talk about. It's not as popular, I think, as it used to be back in the day. We had back in the day, you had Jacob Wilson doing some of the HMB stuff, right? And it coming out and whatnot. And so it got to be this really popular thing with it. The popularity of leucine also kind of contributed to that as well. So anyway, we started doing some of that dietary supplementation research. That was super fun. We started working on using HMB to see if it could improve kind of muscular or limit muscular protein breakdown during prolonged fasting. And then that led into doing things like intermittent fasting studies. So we started doing a lot of intermittent, or not a lot, but he had been doing some, Dr. Grant Tinsley, been doing some intermittent fasting research, and kind of brought me along with that and gave me some really good exposure into how to do a dietary and training study as far as doing intermittent fasting goes. And then we also did a lot of, and this is where my bodybuilder experience came in, is body composition methodology.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask if you were there for any of his body comp work.
So our research was pretty much half and half from what we got done during my master's program. There is the first one are kind of some dietary supplementation things, some hunger and satiety, I guess not satiety, but appetite validation measurements, right? And we can talk about that in just a second. And then, intermittent fasting, dietary supplementation, and some hunger and appetite things. And then some of the body composition methodology. And that's what I did my thesis in, was body composition methodology assessment methods in bodybuilders. And so that was a fun population to work with, so to speak. It's kind of interesting. I always say that it's a great population to work with because you really are interested in the data.
Right.
But trying to get a bodybuilder to change any of what it is that they're doing,
that's hard.
That's much harder. So that's hey,
they're stubborn creatures.
Yeah. So we're basically, what it comes down to is like, hey, I can only come in at 6 a.m. to do this study. Okay, great. I need you to stop eating at 6 a.m. But my last meal is at 9, so I can't do that. Like, please, just for one day, you know how it is to recruit to recruit them. It's like, for one day, could you please be willing to not do this?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd be like, well, I guess so. I know it doesn't sound like a burden to a lot of people. Like, I would change it for one day. But for bodybuilders, it's a burden.
That's like no, that's the end of the world. Like, I will ruin everything. Like, all my progress is done.
So how am I supposed to get all the rest of my protein in today, Austin? Like, I don't know that yet, but we can
figure earlier in the day or something. I don't care. Yeah.
Yeah. Wake up earlier that day and start earlier that day, whatever it might be.
Yep.
But yeah, so we did the body composition methodology. So then after I did my master's with him, I went to TCU. And of course, everything was a little bit different there. So the program was a little bit accelerated. So the research, there was not a lot of ability to kind of deviate in your kind of line of research there, so to speak. So things had to be very specific because everything was so fast paced with it being only 3 years. It's not a ton of time to develop a decent line of research that you would need. So there I did mostly dietary or intake or dietary strategy studies. So it started off originally, had some issues with mentorship kind of thing going on, being like my mentor left. I had to decide whether or not I was going to stay or if I was going to leave, decided to stay because originally from Fort Worth, and everything kind of just worked out. Got with my mentor, Jada Willis, and we had started working on some fatty acid composition work with how it influences appetite. So we say, fatty acid composition. Specifically, we mean whether or not you're doing, saturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, or monounsaturated fatty acids, and how you can kind of, manipulate those to influence appetite during a high fat meal, because high fat meals are incredibly popular right now, especially with things like keto or low carb. Right. People are kind of replacing it with more fats. Well, obviously there are some what you can call good and bad fats, and that's a discussion in and of itself. But how you can manipulate those to help you remain more satiated and less hungry, right? To help you, further your weight loss and things like that.
Right.
And so then we looked at that. We looked at metabolic responses to those same UFAs, PUFAs, saturated fatty acids. And then that got us to the keto stuff.
Mhm.
And so the keto stuff is definitely where a lot of my interests lie. Now, I do have considerable interest in body composition methodologies and assessment methods there.
Right.
But with it being such a kind of like streamlined process at TCU, there really, and lack of necessary equipment and lines or space, it's always a big thing depending on where you're at. We also had all the issues with DEXA, right? Because it doesn't emit the radiation. So that became its own issue in the state of Texas there. And so anyways, wasn't able to do that, but my interest still does remain pretty high in there. And so now that I'm transitioning out of all that, so all that to say that now my interest is pretty much the same, but a little bit more specific now, right? So if our body composition methodology, I've been really wanting to get back into that.
Right.
Now with that, it's right now my model of thinking with research is not necessarily the entire, okay, well, it doesn't work in this population, it does work in this population, population versus population, and validating, whether or not something works or doesn't work depending on the population or something like that. It's really the problem solving. And so identifying, okay, these methods already exist, these people are going to do it, right? We either need to identify whether or not there's a problem with them doing it, or we need to be able to solve a problem that is already pre-existing. So let's say we're talking about the body composition methodology. One thing that I want to do now is, because we've gotten into the realm of 3D optics,
right,
with body composition. So you can see like your Fit 3Ds is a brand that you can look up. You maybe can post that or something in the link. You can look that up. Naked Labs, right? You got all these different devices that basically these images of you through what's called time of flight. So basically like how long it takes for this, light or this photograph to actually hit you. And it creates these little cloud points of data kind of across the body. So like almost like if you were designing a video game, right? If you've ever seen somebody designing a video game, it starts off with all these little points, and then the points connect by lines, and then it creates a human being. And then you fill it in, and then you end up getting this little avatar. Well, that's exactly what your 3D body imaging does, but it does it all based off your body circumferences. Mm-hmm. So it gets a circumference of almost every single inch of your body, which is great, right? There's actually a lot of, health implications that can be used for as far as body circumferences there. But it gives you your body fat percentage just based on this 3D avatar that you can get. I don't know exactly how long it takes, but within, a minute or so, right?
Right.
And it gives you this great tracking method. You can actually put your avatars over each other, right, as you track over time with your dietary or exercise regimens. So you can see it based, your changes based on that. And it looks really cool. And there's some utility to it with that.
So with that, I know I've seen, your former mentor, Dr. Tinsley, pumping out a lot of like validity research with body composition assessment methods.
Yep.
With that method, how does the validity compare to, something like that we all know, like DEXA or
Yep. So it actually performs relatively well if you're just looking at it from like a body composition perspective or body fat percentage perspective, right? Now, it depends on what it is that you're, I guess, kind of looking for. So you're kind of limited in exactly what you get from certain devices, whether and not it's going to be a 2-compartment, a 3-compartment, a 4-compartment. So your body composition is made up of several different compartments. So you would have just surface level. One compartment would just be your body mass, right? So how much you weigh. And then you just continue to kind of slice that up all the way down into 6 different compartments where you go with like the atomic level, molecular level, the tissue organ level, like you go all the way down. And things like your DEXA are going to give you a 2-compartment model, right? Which is basically just going to be fat mass and then fat-free mass. So everything that's non-fat tissue. Well, then you add your 3-compartment model in there. Well, now we're able to actually just go fat mass. And then we're able to separate your fat-free mass into our total or body water. And then everything else. So your residuals, right? So your mineral content, your proteins, things like that. And you continue to go down the line. So we talk about how accurate things are. Combining several different assessment methods to be able to collect all of those different compartments is going to be the most accurate way to determine what your body composition is. And this is where I get to the problem solving type of thing, is not everybody has access to that type of equipment to be able to get that. So what needs to happen is you need to be able to make sure that some of these other devices, right, that are going to be more of your 2 compartments, so fat-free mass and fat mass, can actually compare to your 4 compartment models and give you a pretty accurate estimation of what that is. And so what you actually see with your, I say all that to just basically answer your question that most of the, higher level commercial 3D optic devices compare pretty well to DEXA for the most part. And of course, within themselves of tracking across time, they're going to be relatively accurate as far as tracking across time. Now, tracking across time with some of the 3D optics, we don't really know 100% yet because we have to be able to lose weight, gain weight, do all these things across time. And then we also need to determine whether or not there's what we call proportional bias, meaning that does it over or underestimate you based on how big or how small you are, how much body fat that you have, or how much body fat that you don't have, how much muscle mass you have, how much muscle mass you don't have. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How's that typically accounted for? Is there some kind of weighted factor that's normally weighed in, something like that?
Yep. So you do some statistical analyses that could help you kind of or identify that. But really what it is just like, okay, whenever you have more muscle mass, right? Are you coming out with body fat percentages that are much lower on an individual device compared to another device or compared to what you get out of DEXA, let's say. Mm-hmm. So like on DEXA, it may or underestimate how much body fat percentage that you actually have, but that may just be based on how large that you actually are. So the device may have some issues for things like your 3D optics. It may have some issues depending on how big you are. So let's say you're a bigger individual. It may be actually easier to identify you, right, with or in the image. So say you're a really small person and we're talking about how quickly lights can get to you, right? Well, if you're bigger, that light doesn't have as big of an issue getting to you. And so it may actually be more accurate the larger that you are, but as you continue to get smaller or maybe more muscular, it may actually start to over or underestimate what you actually are relative to somebody who was a bigger person. Does that kind of make sense there?
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Yeah, it just depends basically on how big or small that you are and what we just call proportional bias and how that influences what the outcome is for the actual metric itself. And there may be, like I said, differences between devices across time that we don't know about with that. And so we have to have some weight loss studies, right? Or some weight gain studies, right? We may have to do that in separate populations comparatively and go from there. But as of right now, just overall non-specific person, it seems to be an okay method. But again, that's where with the body composition, we can go a little bit further into the problem solving. Is these devices are expensive and you're only going to be able to find them. Now, I hope that we can find some utility in the clinical area so that you can get some really good body fat percentage or some body circumference information in kind of the, general practitioner offices, because that's going to be really big for identifying somebody's risk for developing certain diseases. And the more that we can track and see over time how that's going, I think the better that we're going to be able to help people get to a healthier point in their life. But the only place you're going to be able to have these is out of your commercial gyms, right? And then you're in a weird random setting where somebody's going to be looking at your results and it's not what you would deem as a professional, just some guy working at the front desk, right, that takes you back and tells you to stay on this device, gives you a printout. And hey, some people want to know that. And I think that makes it really easy to get recruits for some of these studies is a lot of people just want to know.
Right.
But do you want to know after you know the first time if it was bad? Right. Or is the ignorance bliss after that? I don't really want to know how much I'm changing at this point. Right. I figured out how bad I was. And, you just generally don't use it. Where I think the utility is going to come in and what I would like to research is actually just or photograph based, where you can do it from your own home, where you have a specific kind of standardized method. Now, standardization is going to be a problem, but we'll have to get there. Is where now everything's going to number one, digital. So everything you're going to do digitally at this point. And then number two, and COVID kind of put us in this space, is that everything is going to be remote. Even doing the general practitioner type things, right? We're doing those more,
exactly. The meeting via Zoom for those, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of people are doing that more often, especially for just basic checkups, right? Not basic checkups as far as like taking blood and getting your blood pressure and stuff like that, but, medication, refills or general questions, right, about what's going on. People are tending to do that more remotely now, which means that even if you did have a cool body composition device in your office, people or half your people are going remotely now. And so you're not getting that information. So how can we collect it from your own home? And I think that the best way to be able to do that is to be able to find different softwares and find different ways to create softwares to take pictures from your phone that can do the same thing as your 3D optic devices, but just from at home, where basically you're just going to turn, take a picture. We estimate some circumferences based on a specific distance from the phone or iPad. We'll have to validate and do some different camera things. There's a lot that goes into that. We still have to figure out, but does that work? And is it going to be comparable to DEXA?
Right. I think if something like that gets off the ground, everybody would be investing in something like that, just because of the ease of access, and especially as long as it's a valid measure and pretty comparable to your other techniques. That's like ideal method. People don't have to go into a facility that may or may not have some well over tens of thousands of dollar piece of equipment, so.
Yeah. And I don't promote people not going outside, of course, but, I do think that it, and the great thing about it too, is that there's not a ton of extra time that you have to dedicate to getting this information. And so not only is that going to be able to, help us, have people get this information more easily without, spending a lot of money, but you can collect it a lot of times. So you don't have to go anywhere. And so this information, you can collect it daily, you can collect it weekly, however you decide, right, that you want to collect it, but you can do it at your leisure. Now, again, you're going to have to come up with some standardization techniques where you're not just taking it, all willy-nilly day by day without some
same place, same device, same distance from the phone or from the device, that kind of thing.
Yeah, same background.
And lighting probably.
Yeah, all those things will have to kind of be, taken into consideration as far as that goes. So you'd have some standardized methods issues that you may run into, but again, things that we're smart enough to figure out for the most part. But from a research perspective, we can see how much that changes in a given day. So depending on what it is that you do, how is this device going to change based on the differences in standardization. So if you do it in the morning, or compared to when you do it later on after you've eaten, compared to, in the evening after you've eaten multiple times, or exercise somewhere in between there, right? How is that going to change or what your body fat percentage comes out to? So there's a lot to do in that realm, which I think is really interesting. But I mean, imagine this, if you were wanting to be as objective as possible as a bodybuilding coach, right? And you don't have access to all these great devices. And maybe some of the clients that you have do, because they may have gyms, commercial gyms that have this equipment, or they may not, whatever. But how easy it would be to just say, hey, check in with me, number one, with your just basic photographs. But those photographs are now also are able to come with a body fat percentage along with it, and a circumference. So you can look at the arms, right? You can look at the legs, you can look at the abdomen, you can look at all these things.
That would just eliminate so many extra steps that you have as a client or athlete or coach, from having to take all these separate measurements. Oh, I've got to go take my chest measurement, my arm measurement, my navel, my hip, waist, thigh, calf. Okay, now I got to go get my body fat tested, and then now I also have to take pictures and send all this information into my coach or my trainer or whatever it is. And streamline sounds nice.
Yeah, and that's what I mean is how easy it would be with how not easy it is, but how much you can do with apps these days to be able to do almost a MyFitnessPal version of that, right? Where you have a coach that can see what it is that you're doing. The pictures are coming out with the avatars. If you don't want to see your own image, but you can have your own image in there. It can basically just make you a silhouette sometimes as well. But anyways, you have all those circumferences. And for someone who's doing bodybuilding coaching, or somebody who wants to just know themselves for their own competition stuff, if you have popular categories like, classic physique, that are all based on proportions, well, now you can look at circumferences along with that too, to say, okay, yeah, my neck circumference is matching everything else. My waist circumference looks great compared to my chest, my arms look great compared, or, my biceps are great compared to whatever else it is. You would know the proportions that matter the most, more so than I would. But, it just offers a lot of information. I think in all honesty, bodybuilding is a really useful, it's a really useful, it can be very useful in bodybuilding more so than maybe some other different sports.
Right.
And so I think that it's an interesting class or category to do. And I actually want my master's student to look at that because he's interested in natural bodybuilding and stuff like that. So, you know how you get whenever you come in as a student and you have all these crazy ideas, and I got to be the one to be like, okay, maybe just a cross-sectional, like you just come one time, we do a couple measurements. I don't think we want to do a full training study. You only got 2 years.
Yeah.
Right. So
I've been there, had that idea shot down in my.
It's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
It's not what I want. You never want to suppress the student and say like,
no.
You want to say that's a PhD project.
Yep.
So anyway, so I'm excited to see that, if he'd be interested in doing something like that.
That's awesome.
But we'll get that. And then just comparing, those photo-based images to other different wearable technologies, or like your new fit scales, which are going to do more of the BIA. So the electrical signaling, where it sends the electrical signal throughout the body and it measures kind of the resistance to the signal and whatnot. So that's kind of the body composition area that I'm going into at the moment. And I think that it's going to be interesting. Can't say how it's going to come out just yet, because there's so much unknown with that in that area. But it could be really cool. So then we have all that discussion just for me to get to like my next kind of areas of research here. And so the next thing outside of body composition is I do want to maintain a lot of research, because it's kind of my biggest interest is kind of everything going on in popular dietary strategies. And it's not necessarily so much as the body composition, weight loss kind of thing, because kind of like we stated earlier, before like the little introduction and everything, was all of these diets, if you do them and you're watching your calories, the protein is fine. And even if your protein's not fine, which I wouldn't recommend, but then you're going to typically lose weight on these diets, right? So then there's the achieving optimal body composition, which again takes more longitudinal, longer term studies, right? So we want to make sure that we can maintain the fat, or, the fat-free mass while reducing some of the body fat mass that you have. So you can still study a lot of these diets to look at that, but it's pretty well established on keto, pretty well established on intermittent fasting, which are two of my biggest areas of interest. But with keto, so we can go there as far as my interest with that goes, is the same thing with body composition. Is we kind of already know a lot of things with this. We know that the ketogenic diet, it works really fast. It has the potential to lead to some different issues depending on population. A study just came out that said that LDL goes up in just normal weight females that are trying keto, right? So do we really want to take college age, females and have a bunch of blood, markers going all crazy when they were already healthy to begin with, right? Then you see some issues where the nutrient deficiencies that you're going to come up against in long duration keto, hurting kind of bone mineral density, right? And so you want to make sure if we're having, young people, especially like young females, right? We don't want them on keto and then all of a sudden they're, osteopenic, right? Just because they've had such long duration nutrient deficiencies from doing keto, even if they do look great and seemingly healthy, there's some underlying issues with those nutrient deficiencies that are going on. So I say, we know some of these things about keto already. We know that it gives you what you want. We know that it does suppress appetite actually, which is a really big one, which is mostly what my research was on, which was the effect of the ketogenic diet on appetite. Now we found some interesting results with that, which I'll talk about in a second after I get to what I plan on researching, I guess. But if we know all these things about keto, it's okay. That's great. We know that the long-term effects of keto are going to potentially wane off, right? Because we're not changing people's natures. We're putting them on a very temporary diet and then saying bye. Or even they may say, okay, I'm done with this now. and then go back to gaining weight. So how can we optimize the ketogenic diet, or how can we find a suitable replacement? And so I think that there's a lot of potential in ketone ester supplementation. And so that's one area that I'm actually super interested in right now, just because being in the ketogenic state, regardless of how you get there for the most part, so whether that be through long duration fasting or that it be through just elimination of carbohydrates, appears to actually be very favorable in a lot of different ways, right? So that's where we get into things like appetite, right? So appetite, typically what most of the research would suggest is that it's most likely, now there's the argument that, is it being in ketosis, or is it the high level of protein and dietary fat that's influencing your appetite? It's likely that, but also likely to be due to a little bit of the ketogenic state that you're in and the level of ketosis that you're at, right? So basically, if the level of ketosis that you're at, so being in that ketogenic state where you're relying on bodily ketones to basically fuel you, how do I say this? I'm trying to make sure I put the words correctly. Is if we know that ketosis and degree of ketosis matters, but that generally in a normal population or just in a normal setting, that most people are only going to reach modest levels of ketosis, right? So typically, whenever you start a ketogenic diet, people think that they're getting up to this crazy level of ketosis. That's not actually the case, right? You typically end up in that kind of like 0.5 range, right? So 0.5 millimoles per liter, just for the units there. That to about 3 to 3.5, right? And that's what we would consider just like moderate or modest ketosis. So it's not this crazy level of ketosis like most people may think that they're in. And in order for you to feel some of these effects, you need a little bit more than that kind of like 3 millimoles per liter amount in there. Typically, you would need about 4 to start feeling a lot of the different effects that you would need or that you would get out of it. But we're not getting there with normal or the normal ketogenic diet. And a lot of that is just because it's hard to do. The next thing is that typically your metabolic adaptations to the ketogenic diet start to plateau after about 2 weeks. So even if you're hard on keto, you're going to go up really high. And then if you plateau at 2 millimoles per liter, that's where you're pretty much going to stay at, no matter how much more that you change, unless you just start completely fasting.
Right. I was about to ask what ways you could try to augment that if you're plateauing, but
yeah, if you plateau, I mean, at that point, it's just not eating, which if you're going to run into more issues, it's more detrimental, I think, overall than what you're actually going to benefit from the extra like ketosis, right? So if you're going to go up another, 2 millimoles after you stop eating, well, eventually you got to eat again. Right. And so that's going to be a huge barrier. And then how much mental distress are you going to put yourself in from restricting that much, which is where you get your people who do intermittent fasting plus keto or 1 meal a day plus keto, and I'm like, man, how many different things do we need to combine before we go back to just the original principles of, calories, protein,
right.
And self-selection is based on what your nature is and what you prefer. Again, that's here nor there, but yeah, you need that level of ketosis that plateaus off for things like appetite to have an effect in a lot of ways. That being your own subjective experience with appetite. Typically, in studies that we've done, you see that, just being on the ketogenic diet itself is going to lower your physiological markers of appetite, right? Or influence them, because some raise and some decrease. So like ghrelin, your hunger hormone, when you're on the ketogenic diet, actually plummets, right? So that would ideally tell you that you're not hungry, right? Because the ghrelin is obviously suppressed. Then you have things like GLP-1 or glucagon-like peptide 1, which will actually increase, and that's your satiety hormone. So that tells you that you're full, right? Or that's supposed to signal to the brain all of these things. Ghrelin and GLP-1 are supposed to signal to the brain, right, that you are no longer hungry and that you're full. But your brain is very, very powerful and actually has the ability to kind of override some of those different physiological signals, right? So I have my executive function. If no matter what my ghrelin says, and no matter what my GLP-1 says, I can still put food in my mouth. And now that's going to get into where we have the taste thing come back into play. and how much reward you get out of certain tastes, right? And if you're getting that reward, once you hit that kind of reward threshold in the brain, you can keep eating no matter how much or how low your ghrelin is, how high your GLP-1 is, and some other various hormones that are going on. You have that executive function, which is much more powerful than anything physiologically. And that doesn't even have to be just taste. That can be driving by something that you've eliminated from your diet. That can be driving by Chick-fil-A or smelling Chick-fil-A, all these food cues that you're getting, right? You're smiling at me. What do you think? What you think?
It's just like so interesting that our executive function like that overrides what we think is like, be all end all, like these biological functions really dictate exactly what's happening. If these leptin levels or GLP-1 levels are higher and these ghrelin levels are lower, you're not going to want to eat. Doesn't matter if those are low or vice versa. They're not going to want to eat. But it's just crazy to think that it's kind of our these higher functioning and higher executive function here, just by like looking at like, God, that burger looks good over there. I'm starving now,
I mean, when we're talking about behavior, that's a whole different kind of Pandora's box that we're opening there on what your brain is actually capable of, and it's kind of that mind over matter thing. It's not always positive, right? Sometimes the matter, which is some of those different hormones that are circulating, right? Are just unequipped to be able to handle the power of the mind. And what the mind wants, typically the mind is going to try and justify or try and get. And it can be like we had said, something as easy as just seeing it or thinking about it, having this, they say that your olfactory system is one of the biggest things for nostalgia, right? So when you smell that food, like, oh, I remember smelling that Chick-fil-A that one time whenever I ate it, and it smelled so good. And when I drive by it, it smells great. And I'm getting that feeling of potential reward. And now all of a sudden, it doesn't really matter what my body says. Now I'll backtrack a little bit on that, is it does appear, those hormones that you have, those appetite hormones, while a little bit unstable in normal populations and sometimes, and some of your normal populations, those things typically correlate. So typically if you have higher ghrelin, you're not going to rate yourself as being as hungry, right? Or sorry, if you have lower ghrelin, you're not going to relate yourself as being as hungry. If you have higher GLP-1, then you're going to rate yourself as being relatively full, right? Especially postprandially after a meal and whatnot. Now, that's where we get into differences between populations, where this would matter with differences between populations in the realm of appetite, where you would have, individuals with obesity or overweight are more prone to overeating because they've got a lot of different resistances going on in the body. So let's say we're taking, the ghrelin, so the hunger hormone, right? Individual with obesity or overweight eats a meal, and their ghrelin is going to go way down, right? Well, typically what happens is that you have that ghrelin go down, but they still maintain this sense of hunger, right? So regardless of kind of what the ghrelin is doing, again, they're going to maintain that sense of hunger, which is not what you would typically see in like a normal population where those two things would typically correlate, right? Or you have an insufficient ghrelin response depending on degree of obesity. So kind of that overweight classification, right, where you're, not necessarily obese or not necessarily obese, you're going to have kind of that discrepancy between what the mind is saying, like I'm hungry, by saying I'm not hungry with that ghrelin. Once you get to that level of obesity, then you're going to just have insufficient or deficient ghrelin responses, right? Where you're not going to actually have that suppression occur. And so again, you maintain that sense of hunger. And so you eat and you don't really feel full. And you don't have nothing to signal to the brain, right, to tell you to shut off hunger, that you're not, or that you're no longer hungry. And so then you get to that point of, do you sympathize with individuals that have obesity, which, is kind of a big thing right now. And I would agree in that realm. Yeah, for sure. Because imagine that you ate something and you could almost never feel satiated because physiologically it was just not happening for you. Right. So there's that's going on. So again, it differs kind of based on population. Then you get into things like we do with our cyclists, where it's less about the hormonal response. The hormonal responses are acting just fine. You eat, right? The ghrelin goes down, right? Especially with the ketogenic diet. You eat, especially or on the ketogenic diet, the GLP-1 goes up. So you're satiated, you're not hungry. But we've eliminated carbohydrates out of their diet, which is something that they eat all day, every day. That's what they use to fuel their training. They bring their gels that have carbohydrates in them. They drink their Gatorades, right? They do all of these things that revolve around carbohydrates. And not only are you taking away something that they're normally eating to satisfy their hunger, right? But now we're influencing their performance. Now they're not having the carbohydrates that they typically have to be able to perform at a high level. And so there's all kinds of different internal issues or, a lot of psychological issues that are going on that are saying, no, I don't really care what my hormones say. I am so hungry right now. And that's kind of what we found in our last study, which was that, the hormones on the ketogenic diet said, hey, you're not hungry and you're actually relatively full, but you're increasing hunger you're increasing in subjective ratings of hunger up here at the same time that the ghrelin continues to go down.
Right.
And so it's incredibly interesting. Again, so yeah, that's kind of what that was. I don't know if you wanted to chime in on that at all.
No, I mean, I remember being on board with that study. I remember like seeing that, like these people on the ketogenic diet, like kind of watching their responses on the visual analog scale. You're like, you just had a super high fat shake like an hour ago. Like, how are you still
thousands of
why
calories.
are you still so hungry? But I mean, that makes sense now. That it does.
Yep. Yeah. And, so there's a lot that goes into that, in regard to appetite. And then you go into like the cognitive effects of keto and stuff like that as well, where you would need that same high level of ketosis to be able to have the cognitive improvements. Now, that's pretty well researched, is that you're going to have some cognitive improvements with doing the ketogenic diet. And a lot of it, again, is related to having that high level of ketosis. And so, I typically, as a history lesson, historically keto was used before we use it for weight loss to actually help with epilepsy. Right. And so that's kind of where it all began because of the effect that the ketones are having in the brain. And so you end up having these really positive cognitive changes that go on in the brain, which help you eliminate some of your brain fog, right? That you may feel some of that mental fatigue. You kind of feel some better mental acuity happening whenever you have high level of ketones. So the ketogenic diet appears to be really good for that, which is also why people doing intermittent fasting will also suggest that they have better cognitive performance doing intermittent fasting. Again, it's most likely not because of intermittent fasting, because typically there's no specific diet with that. It's a timing strategy. They're fasting all morning. And then a lot of them will take caffeine, and there's some cognitive improvements with caffeine as well. So you got the caffeine, you got some ketones, all that is going to improve your cognitive performance. Right? So that's why you'll hear that happening with intermittent fasting. Now, the issue again comes back to how high can you get your ketones to? And so that's where the ketone esters can come into play, where you can basically, we know that being on the ketogenic diet, again, results in modest levels of ketosis, and there's a high probability you're going to go in and out. Right. And so you're going to probably slip up a little bit, or you're going to do your week or your 5-day keto and then your weekend non-keto, and then, going back and forth. And it's really hard to get a high level of ketosis and the benefits of going into ketosis while doing the ketogenic diet. And then, of course, if you are able to maintain it, it's only a matter of time before you get back out. Right. Unless you were just hardcore. And so anyways, how can we get you to be in ketosis without having you follow the ketogenic diet? And that's where maybe the ketone esters can help you or have some of those benefits. Right. So we can put you into this hyper keto state. Right. And it's acute, of course. So it only lasts for about 5 hours typically. But there's a lot that you can do within 5 hours on a high level of ketosis, where you're going to get up into that 5 millimoles, right, range there. Now, again, of course, once they are done circulating, and whether or not that's going to be your primary energy source is kind of still up for debate. But recent research does show that, at least compared to dextrose or in a control, it influences appetite. So we know that it's actually being utilized in regard to appetite from just the ketone ester supplementation. Some research in mice, which is not a great model, but mice are not a bad thing to look at, I don't think.
They're basically
for just
right?
like, for it to open up the door, you know, to something that may or may not work, right? Or may work. And some of the interesting stuff in mice would suggest that it does improve endurance performance, at least. Now there's a lot of other things that you can do with it, and it's kind of a novel thing at the moment. So we want to look at it from appetite. We want to look at it from cognitive performance, which again, there appears to be some good evidence that it would improve cognitive performance without having to do intermittent fasting or without having to do the ketogenic diet. And then we want to look at pretty much just long duration use. And so what happens with long duration use from every perspective, metabolic responses, right? Metabolic adaptations.
Right.
And if that long-term use is going to, make some significant changes overall, especially with body composition and stuff like that as well. Now, the issue you run into with the ketone esters is that they are so expensive to make.
Right. And that really kind of limits accessibility for a lot of people. So
pretty much no one can really afford to use them at the doses that you would apparently need to at the moment. So we still got to figure out dosing. And I think that the best method right now is to not go by body weight, which is not something I would typically recommend. But if we're going by body weight, I mean, we're using a bottle in a jug of 30 servings at 12 grams right now in like 4 days. And those jugs are $50.
Yeah.
And so, at that recommended dose, which we still have to kind of figure out, no one really has that luxury of spending $200, or hundreds of dollars a month on ketone supplements, especially if we don't have concrete evidence on if it works long term, right? What all it's actually doing. It is safe to use, but it's just not feasible at the moment. So I would recommend doing just the kind of classic dose at the moment, almost just like whatever, you do, maybe you need 35 grams of protein, but you're only getting one scoop, right? And maybe that's all you can afford. There's probably some evidence it would be smart to see what you get out of one scoop, maybe, right? So that's kind of where I'm going with that. Maybe it's not the best example, but let's see what it can do at the current market dosing, and then see what happens as the evidence progresses and maybe more people have access to manufacturing it. That's the other big one, is that the patent holders are keeping it hostage.
Makes sense.
At the moment.
Makes sense.
I don't hate on it, but it's definitely.
I get it.
Yeah, for sure. So then there's that kind of aspect of everything. And then there's, of course, the intermittent fasting stuff that I would like to continue. Now, it's been a while since I've done some intermittent fasting stuff. So just overall idea with intermittent fasting, as far as what it is and how I plan to research it, would be obviously intermittent fasting. And now I'm talking specifically, there's intermittent fasting as an umbrella term. And there are a lot of different ways that you can intermittently fast, because that's all it really is. So basically, we don't really even like to use the term intermittent fasting, but for the sake of the podcast, if people understand it better that way, we'll use it. But in general, you would call it time restricted feeding.
Right.
Because if you've eaten and then you don't eat again for 3 hours, you've intermittently fasted.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So we call it time restricted feeding. So you're restricting your feeding to a particular time, day, feeding window, so to speak. Now, as far as the different types that there's your traditional, which is your 16-8, so 16-hour fast, 8-hour feed. And then you can do, your 24, there's even some, research out there to go as low as, what is it? Oh gosh, what is it? Oh, where you don't, I have to go back and recheck on all the different ones that are out there right now, but those are, the typical ones.
Right.
Then you get into your alternate day feeding.
Yeah.
Right. So feeding every other day, or only eating a certain amount, percentage of your calories on one day, like 25% of your calories on one day. And then eating the 100% the next day, and then 25, however you want to do it. Then there's your 1 meal a day, which again is you're intermittently fasting when you do 1 meal a day. Don't know how that works out for people, but some people do it. So it's obviously worth investigating for sure. But let's just keep it into the 16-8. Right. And in your field, there's actually a lot more research coming out about timing that out strategically as far as circadian rhythms and how that's actually going to influence, you know, whether or not intermittent fasting is going to be more or less successful. But in general, when you think about just basically time restricted feeding, doing things like the 16/8, compared to caloric restriction, there's really not that much difference in weight loss and body fat percentages. Right now, there still needs to be a little bit longer term studies that go on. You know, there were only been a few that have kind of looked at it, but we talk about just restricting calories at every meal. So let's say you're eating 5 meals a day and you're just restricting calories at every meal versus doing the intermittent fasting where you're restricting calories for a certain amount of time and then fitting them all in within an 8-hour feeding period. There doesn't really seem to be too much different on, let's say, weight loss, right? Or body fat percentage loss. There may be some evidence, depending on the protein content of the diets, that you may be able to retain some more fat or some more muscle mass. I will say right now, I'm not as certain about. I would have to go back and look. So as the good scientist in me, I would say I don't really know that. Right. The other ones, it's pretty concrete there. Now, the good thing about the intermittent fasting is not necessarily the weight loss benefits. Yes, hey, you're probably going to lose weight on it, and you're going to lose weight just like you would with a traditional caloric restriction, right? So long as you're calorically restricting on the intermittent fasting too, right? So let's just put that caveat out there. What intermittent fasting seems to do the best is help you eliminate the consistent hunger that's going to happen whenever you're doing traditional caloric restriction. So you actually, whenever you're fitting everything into that kind of 8-hour window, you're actually eating enough to be able to reach a level of satiation, right? We're like, oh, okay, I actually had a good meal, right? I feel good. I've either felt that reward or I feel satiated. I've had kind of those mechanical signals of fullness, like the stomach distension, right? So everything's signaling to me like, yes, okay, I've eaten a good meal like I'm used to eating. Whereas with caloric restriction, if you're kind of restricting throughout the day, you're really never reaching that satiated or that really like nice and satisfied point, right? And so you're always kind of maintaining that sense of hunger, right? Which is going to lead you to have bigger issues later on down the line when you're like, okay, I can't stand it. I'm hungry. I need to eat more. And now you're going into that caloric surplus passively just because you're having maintained that sense of hunger. Whereas with intermittent fasting, you're like, okay, I'm good. I'm actually stuffed because I fit thousands of calories in an 8-hour period.
How long does, like, when we're talking about our intermittent fasting and someone's putting in, 1,000 calories within this certain window, how long are satiety levels typically elevated for your everyday average individual?
So, or you mean within the intermittent and the actual feeding period, or just like after?
Right.
Yeah, because typically you do it all the way up until kind of the evening or the evening time. And so once you go to sleep and you wake up, that's where it goes into people who traditionally eat breakfast or don't, where it may be more successful, right? So I'm generally not I've started eating breakfast, but mostly because if not, I will get so busy. If I don't eat breakfast, I'll get so busy that I won't eat again until dinner. And so if I don't eat breakfast, and I'm not eating until, way late in the day. So I'm a breakfast eater because of that. But I'm typically not a big breakfast eater. But in that regard, intermittent fasting may work really well for me, right? So that's not answering your question specifically, but I'll get there, I promise. Right. So it may have utility or greater utility in people who don't eat breakfast already. Now, whenever you actually start feeding after your fast, so let's say you're doing just a 12 to 8, right? So a noon to 8 feeding window, it's really kind of just depends on the size of each meal that you're having. Now, this is where we get more into the specifics of everything on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So if we're trying to accomplish, let's say, just basic weight loss, right? Then you need to be a little bit more careful about how you're divvying up your protein across there. Not that there's concrete evidence on like you need, there was for a while, like you don't absorb all the protein that you eat. Okay, well, there may be some, there may be some nuance within that, like how big you are, or how much protein that you actually require, training status, all these things. But in general, you don't want to just be consuming like 70 grams of protein, because then you're just not getting any extra benefits from the protein that you're consuming.
Right.
Right. At that point, and you probably would or benefit more by spacing it out to a different time. So if we're taking that out of the mix, right, let's say you just want to lose weight, okay, and you're not really super concerned with amount of protein that you're getting, although I would recommend that that's super important for losing weight. You would probably remain satiated depending on size of meal. So if you're trying to be aware of your protein, the sizes of your meals are probably going to be smaller, because you're trying to divvy up your protein across, 2 to 2.5 hour windows.
Yeah.
Right. Now, if you're not, and you're trying to just fit food in within an 8 hour window, you're probably having bigger meals, which is going to relate in you remaining full for a longer period of time, if that makes sense. So if you're only doing, 2 meals and kind of a snack, right, you're going to be pretty full. You're not going to have too many issues with hunger in that point. Now, the more that you're divvying it up, right, which again kind of gets a little bit more annoying than anything, depending on how much you want to divvy it up, meaning that, are you really reducing the stress of eating on yourself, right? That's the idea of intermittent fasting, is it's too hard for me to get all these meals in kind of throughout the day. So I'm going to skip breakfast, fit it all into a window when I'm more able to eat, make it easier on myself that way, and be able to be satiated. Well, it puts, in my opinion, more stress on you to have greater meal frequency within an 8 hour period. So I'd probably recommend just spacing them out at a normal amount, maybe 3-3-2,
right,
kind of thing, right? So that you can continue to not have excessive burden and maintain fullness, right? Whereas if you were to do it like every hour or every hour and a half, you're still not able to eat that much per meal, right? And so you're going to remain satiated, but you never really reach, a good level of satiety there, in my opinion. Now, it might be different for people, and it depends on how many calories that you're getting per meal. And there's a lot of nuance and things that go on into that, but you would maintain satiety relatively well.
Cool. It just depends on meal, your timing, your meal size.
Hyperverbal way of me to say it depends on meal size, and then of course meal composition. So if you're not having a high protein meal right within there, then you're going to be less satiated than if you were to have a higher protein meal in there, because we know protein is going to be the most satiating macronutrient. So if you're a bodybuilder or somebody that's exercising and conscious of their protein intake, you're probably going to be more full. You're probably going to maintain a sense of fullness to a greater degree than somebody with the same amount of calories and same strategy that's consuming less protein and then like more carbohydrates, things like that. So again, it depends on the macronutrient composition. So obviously higher protein would be better. A very not a tedious meal frequency distribution, and then just making sure that the meal is large enough to be able to satiate you. Now, again, you get into a whole nother can of worms there really quickly, though. So I know that, I think it's interesting. So you'll see me smile when I think something is super interesting, and at least something worth discussing.
Right.
Which would be, okay, so now you're intermittent fasting. And this is something that we talked about even with our keto and our cyclist, right? Is you're intermittent fasting and you're maintaining this sense of fullness. What if you need to eat more? Does that make sense? So let's say like one of our cyclists who need to have like 4,000 calories, right? And you're trying to fit that within an 8 hour window. Shoot, that's a lot of calories to fit within a day, right? For a lot of people. Now, what about somebody who really needs to get those 4,000 calories in to basically just maintain their weight, given their extreme training or that they do, and you give them this really gigantic meal, right? And I'd say it's like 2,000 calories. It's super high in protein meal. I'm just making things up for the situation at this point, but you give them this like really crazy meal. What if they don't want to eat again, right? What if they still maintain this fullness for, 5 hours after this point, or 6 hours, or however long? They just aren't hungry because of this meal that they've had, along with the appetite suppression you're going to get from endurance training. So you have things like what we call exercise-induced anorexia. which is where you'll do some high levels of endurance training and you'll actually you'll have no appetite afterwards, right? So you have the training that's stopping the appetite. You've got the appetite thing going on from potentially a high level of ketosis, right? Then you've got a high or big gigantic meal that you just ate at the very beginning of your fasting window. And now you might not eat again. So you're only getting 2,500, 3,000 calories, but you need 4,000, right? And so again, it's really contextual as far as what that 8-hour window should look like. And it depends on, like I said, the person. So if we're talking about weight loss, sure, man, you need to be in a caloric deficit. I don't recommend anything extreme, but stay in a caloric deficit, pick your meal frequencies, eat enough protein, eat what you like, make sure that you're just, taking into consideration those foundational things like protein and calories, vitamins, minerals, of course, too. But whenever we get to somebody who has to be more strict and they want to go on intermittent fasting, or they need to eat a lot, let's be careful. Let's be a little bit more strategic and make sure we're actually able to hit what we need to hit in order to keep you healthy. Mm-hmm. And then if we're not, then let's deviate it. Or if we're at a point where we're eating too much, then we, again, go back and kind of change the game plan. And that's where coaching and things like that can come or be really important, and tracking and making sure you're writing these things down objectively, right, too.
Yeah.
Another area of research I'd like to get into with the nutrition department here, on just the ease of being able to try, again, problem solving. Let's make this way easier. Even MyFitnessPal is great, but you have the high motivation, and motivation is a finite resource. You start calculating everything. I'm taking pictures of everything. I'm putting in my serving sizes. And then all of a sudden, I don't really feel like recording all this stuff anymore, man. It's too much work.
Exactly.
I missed a meal one time, and I'll put it in later, and then it never gets put in. And so it's easier to be able to monitor the athletes and everything too, or just people in general, which I'm sure you deal with quite a bit on, hey, I need these calories and these macros from you now.
Yeah.
Where were you at yesterday?
Exactly. Like, oh, I forgot to enter in the past 2 days into my spreadsheet for you. Sorry. Okay. Well, now that affects kind of what we're doing going forward. So
you thought you were going to get that cheat meal on Saturday, but because I don't know what you did, we can't do that.
It's probably not going to happen. Yeah, exactly.
So that again, yeah. So it's important to do that with intermittent fasting and special populations there. And then, not that it's an area of research necessarily for me, but you have people who do intermittent fasting plus keto, right? Or paleo plus keto. And there's just a combination of diets. And, that's where you get into the really interesting thing of even what we did with our surveys studies, endurance athletes, is how many people that don't follow a diet, right? That don't follow a diet had attempted a diet in the past, had attempted at least 3 diets previously, fad diets specifically, right? And combined diets together. It's crazy what I can't say it exactly right now, but it's crazy how many people fall into that category of 2 to 3 diets that they've attempted plus combining diets all at the same time. So
yeah, that's just so much to me.
It comes into a lot of, in my opinion, and you can even see this in some of our data, is that a lot of it is purely recommendation, right? Is where are you getting your information from? Other people, right? They tell me this diet. I look on social media. They're saying that I should do this diet, that this diet is the best. And so they just kind of start going crazy with it, right? And that's where we're seeing kind of the bigger issues with things like that, as far as which diet people are doing and why these diets are the most popular. Well, it's the ones that are most, popular in the media. If you look on Google, if you're to go to Google Trends now, it's not recent because COVID kind of messed everything up. But I think 2018, Ketogenic Diet was the #1 most Googled diet in the world. And then in 2019, 2020 got messed up, but 2019, it was intermittent fasting, right? And so those are the most popular diets in the media and in social media. And so that's what most popular diets are in the general population. And so we got to be able to figure out these diets and how to make them, or how to optimize them based on, situation and context. So there's that side of it. And then again, my next kind of line there with intermittent fasting, and I'll hurry this part up because extended my intermittent fasting thing on a little bit, is use of dietary supplementation during intermittent fasting. So previous research, we used HMB basically to see what are, how well we could retain, right, muscle during or extended periods of fasting.
Right.
Right. But I think instead of looking at it that way, as far as muscle gain and during resistance training or muscle retention during resistance training, would be even things like the use of ketone esters or caffeine or things that people are already going to be doing and what happens with that. So let's say you're intermittent fasting. Are you going to be able to use, can you use these ketone esters to help satisfy your hunger in the morning if you're typically a breakfast eater and this is something you want to do? But the thing that's eliminating you from doing intermittent fasting, which maybe you shouldn't be doing intermittent fasting, but that's a whole different question itself. Right. Can you eliminate some of that hunger by the consumption of ketone esters? And that may be really useful for ketone esters, right? If you only have to do the recommended dosing to get you to a good satiated state, or the not recommended, but the actual manufacturer dosing. Right. And so then all of a sudden you have somebody who couldn't be on a diet because they couldn't control kind of their early morning eating. Well, now you can get them to at least have some level of structure with their eating, as so long as they're able to like use this ketone ester potentially, let's say, to help them satisfy their hunger up to their eating period. Now, whether or not that's going to result in binge eating, during that 8-hour window, right, where they're, are going to eat way too much during that 8-hour window, that's another question in itself. And if the ketone esters, if they're working in the morning, if you're going to have this crazy sensation once your eating period comes, how long is it going to keep you satiated for? And are you going to have some issues afterwards? And then again, just go back into your old habits of eating way too much, even with that 8-hour period. Nonetheless, then you can look at caffeine. Caffeine obviously has some appetite suppressive effects to it, but more than anything, most people are probably drinking caffeine in the morning, right? I mean, yeah, I cannot go without caffeine in the morning, right? So I would assume that although people are intermittent fasting and they really shouldn't be doing anything except for, drinking some water in the morning, I guarantee you 100% that people are drinking, whether it be energy drinks or, 0-calorie beverages, or just even, coffee technically would not be what you want to drink, but I bet you people are doing it and still trying to do their intermittent fasting. So I think that's something that's at least important to look at as far as differences in weight or in weight loss and in performance, cognitive improvements, appetite, all those things that we like. So that would be a really good one to look at as well, for sure. So then I say all that to get you to my last, I promise, this is my last little research line here, is I think, again, when we talk about, hey, Chris, 1 second for me. Can you give me a few minutes? Yeah. Perfect. I'll come get you. Okay. Awesome. Oh, sorry. We got the shared lab here. That's okay. But anyways, right. As far as the research goes, if we can kind of agree that, doing these diets doesn't work and that we want to work to try and make them as successful or useful as possible. Some of the things that I've described kind of previously, which I think is important, because I don't think that you're just going to eliminate these diets by saying, hey, no diets work. That's not really going to stop anybody. You're still going to have influence from everywhere around you, from testimony or from personal testimonies, from people who don't really know what to do. And that at least this gives them a guideline on something that they can do. Right. Because there's another big part of it too, is I don't really know what to do, but I know there's keto, which basically means this. And my friend had a really good experience with it. So let's try it. I don't want to get away from trying to improve it if people are going to continuously do it. So that's where I think it could be the most helpful. I think the next most helpful thing we can do is say, okay, none of these diets work, specifically the ones that are super restrictive. How about we start comparing all these things together against a diet that, what you would refer to as flexible dieting, right? Meaning that, okay, let's say we just create a quick study, here right now, is you have somebody that does keto and we'll have them work with like RDs or something like that, just to, make sure that they're following it, because we want to be really efficacious with this one. Have somebody that does keto versus somebody that's going to do high carb, right? Now let's have that third group, or, maybe versus a control. But then how about versus somebody where they get to choose within a certain, caloric deficit, what they want their fat and carbohydrates to actually be day by day or week by week, where you allow them to be flexible and change based on the sensations that they're having. Like, oh man, I'm really wanting this particular type of food, or I'm like, or been really carb heavy and man, this fat is just speaking to me, or I'm really fat heavy, right? But I really just don't want to do that anymore. But on keto, I wouldn't be able to have carbs and I really want them, right?
Right.
Well, how about we do a diet where we just allow them to have that flexibility, and we do it a little bit more long-term, at least 12 weeks or so, and then see, not only, I would anticipate that if everybody is strict, right, over a 12-week period, and that they're staying in their caloric deficits the way that they're supposed to, that you would see similar weight loss. And then what we really want to look at is different subjective perceptions. Really bring in some of those questions on, okay, how difficult was it for you, right? How much did you enjoy, or what was your dietary satisfaction? Did you enjoy doing these things? Do you think this is realistic for you to continue to do, and really get almost some kind of this qualitative research in there.
Right. It's establishing the sustainability for the population.
Right. And you would anticipate that after a certain period, that you'll have some people in the keto group, depending on how you allocate it, that would say, this has worked really well for me. And now you have to control for that by saying, what their previous diet was, right? On saying, okay, well, the person that got allocated in here, or you may have to stratify them based on what their previous diet was into a certain group. Like, hey, this is the opposite of what you normally do, right? Or let's keep you in line with what you normally do. Those would be probably multiple studies there. Right, but basically saying, okay, you would anticipate that a lot of people would not enjoy, right, not having that flexibility after a certain point, right, regardless of whatever it was saying on the scale, right, where it ends up getting difficult, or, hey, sorry, you can't do this social interaction. You can't have the cake at the wedding. You can't do all of these things, right, because you're on this particular diet, which is going to start leading into that, dietary failure. Well, now how about we look at it from the opposite end and say, like, hey, we know the principles. Let's let you choose. If you want to try keto one week and then kind of go backwards and forwards or whatever, right? As long as we're in that caloric deficit, maybe we just allow you to choose what you do day by day. And when I would imagine that flexibility would probably allow them to say, like, yeah, this seems like something that I can do, so long as I'm conscious of what I'm eating, keeping my calories what they need to be. This seems to work, actually, right? And I can make those decisions and not have detrimental failure, and then do some follow-ups after that and see, the differences between, X months later.
Makes sense. I mean, so a lot of stuff a lot of times I see with just people dieting in general, flexibility equals sustainability in a lot of cases. So it sounds like a good idea that could possibly work in theory. So,
you would imagine that it would already exist.
Yeah. Right.
Right. But it really doesn't. And it's measuring those kind of more hardcore diets specifically, of course. Right? But it really doesn't in a longer term study. And then, of course, based on population, we don't want to do this in individuals that are of normal weight anyways, because they're obviously doing just fine, right? We're looking at this specifically for the overweight, obese or individuals that continuously have the success and the failure, And, there's some the research to suggest that the more diet attempts that you have, the worse that it gets for you to lose weight the next time, and the next time, and the next time, and the next time. If you're not able to establish, right, the first initial diet and lose the weight the first time, you go into that low high metabolic efficiency,
right?
Which you would think is a good thing. That's not a good thing, right? You want to be burning as many calories as possible, not using calories conservatively. And so the more diets that you do, obviously, right, the more failed attempts that you have, then the greater metabolic efficiency that you have, and then eventually your calorie burning gets destroyed, similar to what you would see, after extreme diet or crash diets like with bodybuilding and stuff like that. You end up being very metabolically efficient, right? So you're not using calories a lot, then you eat a lot of calories, and then you end up, post show looking awful, not like a bodybuilder,
right?
So, yeah, all of that, man, lots of stuff.
That's awesome. I'm excited to see every direction that you could possibly take there. With all that, I'm very curious, and I could go on asking more questions all day, but we will make people listen to.
Yeah, I know. I started looking at the time, and I was I think,
we'll come back for another one. Don't worry. Where once you actually get started in some fun stuff, we'll dig into it even heavier for those that are interested. But since you've been in front of a computer screen for the past 4 hours, we will release you.
Yes. All right. Thank you for releasing me, but yes, thank you for just letting me come on and talk about everything today. I like, we had nice, good, unstructured conversation as always.
That's always fun. That's what the people like to listen to.
I agree.